The storm didn't announce itself. It arrived the way cold always does at altitude, silently, from the side, pressing through fabric and skin until the body stopped arguing and simply obeyed. Sergeant First Class Darian Cole felt it in his knuckles first, then his jaw, then that deep, animal part of his brain that had kept him alive through 3 deployments and 1 prison of a mountain range he never wanted to see again. The Kush didn't care about experience. It didn't care about rank. It ate men the way glaciers eat rock, slowly, without malice, without any awareness of what it was doing. Visibility? He said into his radio. Static. He tried again, more static, then nothing. The signal dissolved into the white noise of the storm like a stone dropped into deep water. Around him, 8 men moved in tight formation, heads down, weapons up, each one trusting the boots ahead of them because there was nothing else to trust. The world had reduced itself to a 40-foot radius of swirling white. Beyond that, nothing. No ridge line, no tree silhouettes, no stars. The sky and the ground had merged into a single colorless void that gave no information and accepted no argument. Corporal Nathan Briggs, on point, raised his fist. The column froze. "Something's wrong," he said. "Everything's wrong." Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb said behind him, "Be specific." The wind shifted. 12 minutes ago it was northwest. Now it's Briggs wet his finger, held it up. The wind pressed from 3 different directions at once. Indecisive, confused by the terrain. Northeast? Maybe? I don't know. Then we've lost our bearing. No. We had a bearing. Now we have a direction that doesn't match our map. Nobody spoke for a moment. The wind filled the silence. At the back of the formation, tucked between Private First Class Leo Gareth and the rearmost man, a figure moved without sound. She always moved like that, as if she'd learned somewhere along the way that the quieter you are, the more you get to hear. Specialist Ilara Voss hadn't spoken since they'd left the insertion point 4 hours ago. She didn't speak much in general. When she did, it was in units, wind speed, estimated range, degree of shift, angle of inclination, not sentences, just numbers and directions, offered the way a surgeon offers instruments, precise, unpretentious, without needing acknowledgement. She was the spotter, had been since they'd paired her with Senior Sergeant Dale Hutchins 18 months ago. Hutchins was a legend 15 years in, 4 confirmed kills past a mile, the kind of sniper who made newer guys go quiet when they realized they were in the room with him. Hutchins did the shooting. Voss did the seeing. The arrangement suited her perfectly. Nobody paid much attention to the spotter. They praised the sniper. She had understood this from the beginning, and had made her peace with it before anyone needed to explain it to her. Now she stood at the back of the frozen column and watched the storm. She was watching the way it moved. Not the snow itself. The snow was useless, chaotic, following nothing but turbulence. She watched the gaps, the momentary pockets of stillness that appeared between gusts, each one lasting a fraction of a second, each one occurring in a slightly different position, each one telling a small story about the topography they couldn't see. She had a notebook, waterproof. She noted timestamps. She noted which direction the gaps appeared. She noted whether the snow density increased or decreased in those moments. No one asked her what she was writing. No one ever did. "We push west," Cole decided. 50 meters. Then we reassess. They moved. The storm pressed back. Ilara Voss followed the column and kept watching the gaps. The first shot didn't sound like a shot. At altitude, in a whiteout, with wind strong enough to lean against, gunfire arrives stripped of context. It's just a sound, sharp, abbreviated, already passed by the time the brain identifies it. The second shot arrived before Nathan Briggs finished dropping to his knee. The third came simultaneously with the voice in Cole's earpiece that wasn't connected to anything. "Contact." "Where?" "I can't see. 6 o'clock, I think." "No, that's Echo. The rock face is..." "Someone check Webb." "I'm fine. I'm fine." They all went down into the snow. Standard. Textbook, but the snow was a foot deep and the wind was stripping any footprints before they settled, and down in a whiteout meant invisible, which worked both ways. Cole pressed his back against a boulder he'd felt more than seen. He swept his muzzle left, right, nothing. White. White. The particular blank white of a world with no depth perception, no horizon, no anchor. "Hutchins," he said. "I need eyes." "Working on it." Hutchins' voice was calm, the way professional calm always is, not relaxed, but compressed. A man holding something very tightly. "Voss, what do you have?" Ilara was already moving. Not toward cover, toward the edge of the formation's left flank, where a natural depression in the ridge created a moment of wind shelter. She unslung her rangefinder, She didn't raise it immediately. She waited. 1 second. 2. A gap in the snow opened 3 feet wide, 40 meters ahead, lasting less than a breath. In that gap, a shape. 2 shapes. Movement pattern consistent with bodies using cover but not stopping. Moving through cover, which meant they weren't pinned, which meant they were confident, which meant they either outnumbered the unit or they knew something the unit didn't. She looked at her notebook. Her last entry. She looked at the gap's position relative to the entries before it. Hutchins, she said. They're using the wind cycle. A pause. Say again. The gusts come every 40 to 45 seconds from the northeast. During the gust, they move. During the break, they hold. We've been firing at the break positions. They're not there anymore. They've already moved. Nobody spoke. How many? Hutchins said. She did the math she'd been doing in the back of the column for 20 minutes. Assembling fragments into a pattern the way you'd reconstruct a sentence from individual words, not guessing, just recognizing what the evidence implied. 6. Maybe 8. She paused, closing from the north and east. Cole's voice, flat. They're flanking us. They've been flanking us since the first shot, she said. The first shot was the diversion. Another silence. Longer. Then Hutchins. She's right. Cole didn't argue. He'd learned not to argue with Hutchins' read on tactical geometry. What he didn't know was that Hutchins wasn't the one who'd assembled this particular read. He was simply translating something that had already been assembled. Reorient south, Cole said. Move now. They moved. Behind them, in the positions they'd just vacated, the snow erupted in a burst pattern automatic fire. Accurate, angry, searching. 6 inches behind where Briggs had been standing. Hutchins went down between one step and the next. There was no drama in it. No cry. He simply folded left knee first, then his whole left side, and his rifle went one way, and his body went the other, and the snow received him the way it receives everything up here, indifferently, completely. Hutchins. Gareth reached him first. The bullet had entered below the shoulder plate. The angle was wrong for survival if they were 4 hours from a surgical suite and 0 hours from a medevac. Hutchins was breathing. He was conscious. His eyes were open and tracking, and there was clarity in them, the awful clarity of a man who understands precisely what has happened to his body. Don't, he said to Gareth. Don't what? Don't tell me it's fine. I'm a sniper. I know angles. Gareth didn't say anything. Hutchins turned his head toward Voss. She was already kneeling beside him, not for medical purposes. She wasn't a medic, but because she understood that in the next 30 seconds, a decision was going to need to be made, and the only person who should make it was the one who still had all the relevant information. The rifle, Hutchins said. I know, she said. The wind is. I know. He looked at her for a moment. The wind screamed past, and the snow came horizontal, and somewhere in the white nothing, the enemy was completing its flanking arc. They'll kill all of us, he said. I know. He said nothing more. He handed her the rifle with his good arm. Cole was watching. Briggs was watching. Webb, pulling security on the south flank with 2 fingers of a frostbitten hand on a trigger guard, had craned his neck to watch. The rifle was a .50 caliber anti-material platform, custom configured over 3 years of Hutchins' careful adjustments, the kind of relationship a sniper builds with a weapon over thousands of rounds until it stops being equipment and becomes something else. A dialect. A private language. Ilara Voss held it with the certainty of someone who had watched that language spoken for 18 months. She had never fired it in combat. She had fired it on ranges, at Hutchins' instruction, during the long quiet hours that a spotter accumulates while everyone else is talking. She had fired it in wind, in rain, at sunset when the light distorts everything and most shooters give up and go inside. She had fired it badly at first, and then better, and then, toward the end, with a kind of consistency that Hutchins had noticed without saying anything, because Hutchins communicated in the way of all serious professionals, not in praise, but in the increasing difficulty of the problems he assigned. He had been making the problems harder. She understood now why. Cole said, Voss. She didn't look at him. Cole said, we need to move. Can you? Not yet. A beat. Not yet. We move now. They complete the flanking arc, and we have nowhere to go. She still wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the snow. At the gaps, at the patterns in the white she'd been recording since they left the insertion point. I need 4 minutes. We don't. 4 minutes. She paused. Or we all die in 2. Cole looked at Hutchins. Hutchins looked at the sky with the expression of a man trying to stay conscious through an act of pure will. 4 minutes, Cole said. The emergency beacon was the kind of hardware that was supposed to work when nothing else did. It didn't. Webb had the secondary radio. He was pressing buttons with hands that weren't responding properly anymore, not frostbite yet. But the warning signs were there, the stiffness, the delay between intention and execution. He got a carrier signal for 11 seconds, long enough to transmit a grid coordinate, and then the storm absorbed it. HQ won't have our position for at least 2 hours, he reported. Backup won't reach us in 2 hours anyway, Briggs said. Nobody disagreed. The temperature had dropped 8 degrees in the last 90 minutes. Elara knew this not because she'd checked a thermometer, she didn't have one, but because the character of the snow had changed. It was drier now, lighter, falling less like precipitation and more like dust. That happened at a specific threshold, and the threshold was well below survivable for a wounded man lying on a mountainside. Private Denny Hollisworth, 19 years old, 2 months in country, pressed against the same boulder as Cole and kept checking his watch. Not because the time mattered, but because it was the only thing he could control. Every 30 seconds his eyes flicked to the face of it. Cole watched him do it and didn't say anything. The boy wasn't panicking. He was anchoring. Gareth had a compress on Hutchins' wound. Hutchins had stopped talking, which was either good or bad. Sergeant Paul Norris, the unit's secondary marksman, a competent shooter, no more and no less, was trying to use Hutchins's spotting scope. He couldn't find anything to look at. The whiteout was too complete. He was squinting into white and calling back readings that matched nothing in any consistent pattern. Movement north, he said. Wait. No. I don't know what that is. He lowered the scope. She's right, he said quietly, to no one in particular. They're moving with the gusts. We can't track them. She's been right since the first shot, Gareth said. Nobody contested this. The wind screamed. The snow came harder. The world outside the 40-foot radius of their position was pure, murderous white. Elara Voss lay in the snow, 70 meters from the rest of the formation, behind a saddle of rock that she had identified from her gap pattern notes as a windbreak, a place where the storm thinned for 3 to 5 seconds at a time instead of less than 1. She had moved there without announcing it. She had left a mark on the snow with her boot, a direction indicator, so Cole could find her if needed. She was completely still. She had been still for 6 minutes. She was waiting for something very specific. What she understood about wind was this: it was not random. It felt random. It sounded random. At altitude, in a storm, with every gust seeming to arrive from a different direction, the sensation was of total chaos, a system with no logic, no pattern, no possibility of prediction. But she had been watching weather since she was 11 years old. Not with instruments, just watching the way light moved before rain, the way grass pressed, the way clouds organized themselves along temperature gradients invisible to anyone not paying attention. Her father had been a surveyor. He had taught her that the landscape was always speaking, and that the language was pattern repeating, consistent, disguised only by the noise layered over it. The noise was never the message. The pattern underneath was. She had 341 days of watching this particular mountain range's weather patterns since arriving in country. She had a notebook of them. Not because anyone had asked her to keep one, because she couldn't stop seeing things and needed somewhere to put them. What the notebook told her, cross-referenced with tonight. The storm had a rotation, very slight, almost undetectable. But the gaps in the whiteout weren't random either. They traced a rough arc from northwest to east, repeating every 6 to 8 minutes, each gap slightly east of the last. If you knew where to look and when, you got a window, 3 to 5 seconds. 40 meters of visibility at maximum, less usually. The enemy knew the terrain. They'd been using the gust cycles for cover, which meant they had experience with this specific mountain, this specific ridge system, but they didn't know she'd been watching the gaps. Nobody would predict a spotter lying in the snow with a notebook, doing math about meteorology, which was exactly the kind of thing nobody predicted, and the kind of thing that mattered. She had determined 3 things. 1. The flanking element's lead position. The man coordinating the arc's completion was using a specific boulder system approximately 3,800 yards northeast. She had spotted him twice in gap windows, each time in the same area, each time during the 3rd second of the gap's duration. 2. The next full gap window wide enough, long enough, clear enough would occur in approximately 4 minutes. 3. At that distance, in these conditions, without a spotter, without wind data instrumentation, without any of the tools that made a shot like this merely extraordinary rather than impossible, the probability of success was low enough that most trained snipers would refuse the shot. She was not refusing it, she was calculating it. The calculation was not about probability. Probability was a framework for people who had multiple attempts. She did not have multiple attempts. The calculation was simpler than that. This was the only option that existed, which made the probability argument irrelevant. The shot was either taken or it wasn't, and if it wasn't, the men behind her died on a mountainside in a whiteout, and Hutchins died with them, and she would die too, but the part that she could not accept, the part that had been unacceptable to her from the moment Hutchins went down, was the part where she had the capability and didn't use it. She began to settle herself into position. She came back to the formation once. Cole looked at her. She said, "I have the shot." 3 words. Short. No preamble. Cole's face did several things at once: surprise, disbelief, the tactical calculation of a man trying to assess an asset he'd never had to assess before. Voss, what shot? There's nothing visible at 3,800 yards, northeast. The element leader. He's using a specific boulder cluster. I've confirmed his position twice in gap windows. She paused. The next clean window is in approximately 3 minutes 30 seconds. Briggs said, 3,800 yards, in a whiteout. She looked at him, didn't answer. That's Voss. That's Briggs, did the math in his head and then stopped doing it because the math didn't support the conversation ending any way he was comfortable with. That's not a shot anyone takes. Hutchins would, Norris said. A silence. Hutchins isn't available, she said. Cole looked at her with the look of a man who has run out of better options and is staring at the option in front of him, trying to determine how much he trusts it. He was trying to determine, really, how much he trusted her, which meant he was trying to calculate something he'd never had to calculate before, because in the hierarchy of the unit she had always been background, support, infrastructure, the part you didn't think about because it always functioned. If you miss, he said, they know exactly where we are. They already know approximately where we are, she said. The miss gives them precision, but missing is the second problem. The first problem is the window. What happens if you don't take the shot? They complete the arc. She said it without emotion. We have 3 viable directions of retreat. They close 2 of them in the next 7 minutes. The third leads to a drop of 60 meters. She let that sit. I've been mapping their movement pattern since the engagement started. Another silence. Webb was looking at her. Gareth was looking at her. Hollisworth had stopped checking his watch. Let her take it, Hutchins said from the snow. Everyone turned. Hutchins's voice was quieter than it had been, but steady. She's been the eyes of this unit since we inserted. You just didn't know it. A pause, effortful. Let her take the shot. Cole looked at Voss for a long moment. He nodded. She was already moving back toward the rock saddle. 3,800 yards, 3 miles and change. In fair conditions, with a world-class sniper, with a trained spotter, with ballistic tables, and a rangefinder and a wind meter and time, 3,800 yards was a shot that appeared in record books. In the kind of story that other snipers told with a particular reverence reserved for things that shouldn't have been possible. In a whiteout, alone, without instrumentation, it was the kind of shot that nobody would ever take because nobody would survive the professional judgment of having taken it and missed. She wasn't thinking about professional judgment. She was thinking about the wind. She positioned herself behind the saddle, not completely sheltered, because completely sheltered meant no information, and she needed the wind's pressure on her face and hands to feel what she couldn't measure. She needed the snow's density against her cheeks. She needed to feel the tiny shifts in the storm's rhythm through the fabric of her gloves and the skin of her chin and the vibration of the ground through her elbows and stomach. She laid out the rifle. She adjusted the scope to maximum magnification, then dialed it back 2 stops. Maximum magnification in a whiteout was useless. It magnified the white, not the target. At 2 stops below max, she had slightly less resolution but substantially better contrast, which in the current conditions was the superior trade. The scope fogged. She cleared it with the edge of her sleeve. It fogged again. She waited, breath control, the exhalation directed downward, away from the lens. Better, she noted the crosswind component. It was, at this moment, running roughly 30 kilometers per hour from the northwest. But she knew from her notes that it would drop to approximately 18 in the final 2 seconds of the gap window, as the topography east of her position created a momentary lull. 2 seconds at 18 kph was the correction she was working with, not 30, 18. The temperature she estimated at -22 Celsius. At this temperature, at 3,800 yards, the bullet's trajectory would drop approximately She did the arithmetic without writing it down because there was no time, and because she'd done it already in the 60 seconds she'd spent lying in the snow composing herself 43 feet below the line of sight. The optic compensated for some of this. The remainder was elevation correction, which she adjusted manually, feeling the clicks of the turret through her fingertips. No spotting round. She had one shot, perhaps two if the window lasted. She was planning for one. She controlled her breathing. In through the nose, out slow, in, out. The crosshairs drifted with each exhalation. She let them drift. She found the rhythm the moment at the bottom of each breath cycle where the body is still, the heart rate at its lowest point, the body neither inhaling nor exhaling. The natural pause, 1.5 seconds at best. She would fire in the pause. She watched the scope. White, white, white. She watched her notebook page, which she'd pinned under her left elbow. The gap window pattern. The timestamp of the last gap. 38 seconds ago. The next window was, window in 40 seconds, she said, to herself. To no one. She settled. The storm had been screaming for 6 hours. She had stopped hearing it somewhere around hour 3. The sound had receded into background present, acknowledged, no longer processed, the way a waterfall becomes silence if you stand near it long enough. What she heard now, her own pulse. Slow. Slower than it should be given the cold, the fear, the situation. She had discovered years ago that in moments of extreme pressure her body did the opposite of what most bodies did. Instead of accelerating, it slowed. It conserved. It narrowed its attention to the problem in front of it and released everything else. She had never understood why. She had stopped asking. 30 seconds. The scope, white. A shade of white that was different from the shade 2 degrees left, slightly warmer, slightly denser, indicating a rock face that retained heat. She used this as a landmark. The boulder cluster was 3 degrees right of this warmth signature. 20 seconds. She moved the crosshairs 3 degrees right. Nothing visible. Just white. But she wasn't looking at what was visible. She was looking at where the gap would form. When the gap formed, she would have 3 to 5 seconds to acquire, confirm, and fire. She was going to spend 0 of those seconds searching. She was going to spend all of them on confirmation and execution. 10 seconds. She exhaled slowly. She found the pause at the bottom of her breath. She waited. 5 seconds. The wind dropped. It didn't drop to silence. Nothing on this mountain ever dropped to silence. But it dropped to the lower register she'd predicted, the 18 kph lull that the topography created, the momentary exhale of the terrain itself, the 2-second pocket where physics briefly cooperated. The white opened. Not much. A corridor. 40 meters of real visibility in a narrow cone, the snow still falling but suddenly slower, suddenly sparser, the world behind it briefly resolving from void into something: shapes, depth, contrast. At the far end of the corridor, a man, standing, not in motion. He had stopped during the gust, as she'd predicted, and the window had caught him in the still moment. She had less than 3 seconds. She confirmed. Position, posture, the radio handset at his hip that confirmed coordination roll, the bearing of his body toward the northeast which confirmed the flanking direction. She confirmed everything she needed in under 2 seconds. She applied final elevation. She was in the pause at the bottom of her breath. She squeezed. The rifle fired. The sound was very large, and then immediately smaller as the wind took it and distributed it across the mountain's white geometry, breaking it into echoes and reflections until it was indistinguishable from the storm. She did not look away from the scope. The corridor was still open. 2 seconds remaining. 1. The man at the far end of the corridor stopped being a standing shape. He became a falling shape. And then the corridor closed, and there was only white again, and the storm resumed its argument with the mountain, and everything returned to chaos. She stayed still. She counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She did not hear return fire. The flanking element's radio coordination had been disrupted. Without the coordinating element, the arc stopped. It didn't retreat, it just stopped, held in place by the uncertainty that comes when a command node goes silent without explanation. She rose from the snow. She walked back to the formation. 8 men looked at her. The ones who'd been in firefights knew the particular silence that follows an engagement-changing moment. It was different from ordinary silence. It had weight and direction and a slightly stunned quality, as if the air itself was recalibrating. Cole said nothing. Norris said nothing. Briggs opened his mouth, closed it. Gareth, crouched next to Hutchins, looked up with an expression she had never seen directed at her before. She recognized it from the way people looked at Hutchins after a particularly long shot. She had watched it happen many times and never expected to receive it. Hollisworth said, very quietly. She hit it. Not a question, a statement being tested against what he knew about the world, about distance and weather, and the limits of human capability, and finding that the world had accommodated a new data point. She hit it, he said again, and this time the statement wasn't being tested. It had passed. The flanking formation held for 4 minutes. Alara knew this because she watched the gap windows. The movement pattern had frozen positions holding. No further arc completion. The careful distributed motion replaced by the static scatter of a group waiting for orders that weren't coming. They're confused, she told Cole. We have a window to move south. 12 minutes, maybe 15. How do you know 15? Because after 15 minutes, the gust cycle will shift, and they'll be able to move under cover again. And by then they'll have established new radio contact and reorganized. She looked at him, so we need to move in the next 12. Cole organized the withdrawal in under 60 seconds. He'd been doing this for 15 years. When he had clear information, he acted. The information had been unclear for the better part of 2 hours. Now it was clear, and the source of its clarity was the specialist at the back of his formation who he'd been treating. Without fully realizing it, as infrastructure, he wouldn't make that mistake again. They moved south in a tight wedge, Hollisworth and Briggs carrying Hutchins between them. Hutchins was still conscious. He kept his eyes open. He didn't make a sound. The storm had not softened. The cold had not softened. The mountain had not softened. But the flanking arc was frozen, and they moved through its frozen center like water finding a crack in ice, not forced, not dramatic, just following the path of least resistance through a gap that had been purchased at extraordinary cost, and would close in 12 minutes. They made it in 9. The exfiltration point was a rocky overhang on the southern face where the whiteout thinned enough to signal with the emergency strobe. Webb got the beacon working. 22 minutes later, they heard rotors. When the helicopter came in, its lights caught the snow and turned the world briefly golden. Hutchins was loaded first. He gripped Voss's wrist with his good hand as they lifted him. He didn't say anything. He just held on for a moment and then released. That was enough. The debrief happened in a warm room that smelled like burned coffee and wet gear and the particular institutional cleanness of a military facility trying to be a hospital. Cole sat across from her. Norris, a captain she didn't know, named Reeve, who had a tablet and was noting things on it with the focused neutrality of someone building a record. They asked her to walk them through the engagement. She did. They asked about the shot. She described it without embellishment. Range, conditions, calculated corrections, window timing, target confirmation, execution. She gave it in the same format she'd have given a training debrief, matter of fact, sequential, complete. Captain Reeves' pen had stopped moving about 3 sentences in. He was simply listening. When she finished, Cole leaned forward. Hutchins is going to be okay, he said. I know. She'd spoken to the surgeon before the debrief. He'll be out 4 months, maybe 6. They'll find him another spotter. She nodded. Who's going to find you another sniper? Cole said. She looked at him. She wasn't sure how to read the question. That's not my decision. No, he said. It's mine. He was quiet for a moment. I put in the recommendation this morning. A different recommendation from the one I would have put in yesterday. She waited. You're not infrastructure, he said. You're not support. He said it the way a man says something that should have been obvious but wasn't, with the particular directness of someone making right a specific wrong. We just didn't know what we were looking at. She said nothing. Reeve had started writing again. Norris, who'd been quiet through most of the debrief, looked at her from across the table and said, How did you see them? In the whiteout. How did you actually see what was happening? She considered the question. It wasn't a difficult question. The answer was simple, but simple answers often needed a moment to find the right shape. I didn't see them, she said. I saw everything else. Norris's brow furrowed. What does that mean? It means. She thought about the gaps, the timestamps, the notebook full of patterns that the storm had been broadcasting the whole time. To anyone paying attention, it means the enemy was the thing the storm was hiding. So I looked at the storm, at the gaps in it, and where they appeared, and when. At the way the gust cycle organized their movement, at the temperature signature of the rock faces. She paused. They were moving inside the pattern. If you watched the pattern, you could see the shape they left in it. Silence in the room. Like a shadow, Reeves said. Like a shadow, she agreed. Hutchins spent 11 weeks in the hospital. In the 4th week, when he was well enough to sit up and hold a phone, he called her. She answered on the 2nd ring. They told me the range, he said. From the debrief, Sensin Babe, approximately, a pause. She could hear him breathing. "You want to tell me something. You want to tell me you've been ready for a long time," she said. "I don't want to tell you anything. You already know." Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice had something in it she hadn't heard in 18 months of working beside him, something that wasn't quite respect. He'd always had that, but was more specific. The particular acknowledgement one serious professional gives another. "Yeah," he said. "I know. How's the shoulder?" "Hurts like hell. Surgeon says I'll have full range in 6 months if I do the work." "You'll do the work?" "Yeah." A breath. "Voss, what?" "I made the problems harder on purpose. Toward the end, I know. You never said anything." "There was nothing to say. You were doing it right." He was quiet for a moment. No one else noticed. She thought about the months on the range, the increasing distances, the wind conditions he'd added progressively, the times he'd deliberately withheld the ballistic correction and let her derive it independently. "They weren't watching," she said. "No," he agreed. "They weren't watching." She looked out the window of the transit facility. The sky was clear and very blue, and the mountain ranges in the distance were white with snow that caught the afternoon light and turned it to something pure and indifferent. "When do you come back?" she said. 6 months. I'll be here." The call sign came from Briggs. He was the one who said it first. At the base, the night after they returned, not in a ceremony, not in a formal setting, just at the table in the common area where the unit was eating food that was marginally better than field rations and drinking coffee that was marginally worse than nothing. Briggs said it to Norris, and Norris said it to Webb, and by the time Cole walked in and heard it being said across the table in the direction of the woman sitting at the end of it, reading her notebook with the same attention she gave everything, it had already been said 5 times and had the solid quality of something that has already decided to exist. The one who sees in the whiteout. It was too long for a call sign. Nobody cared. Voss looked up when she heard it. She looked around the table. She looked at Cole, who nodded once, with the expression of a man filing a fact. She looked back at her notebook. She wrote something in it. Nobody asked what. The storm outside the facility was beginning to build again, another system coming off the mountain, according to the weather station, expected to last 48 hours. Through the window, the snow was starting. Small, dry, beginning to accumulate. She watched it. She noted the direction it was moving. The density. The way it organized itself along the invisible topology of the wind. The storm was speaking. She wrote it down.